I think we're in for a very, very special treat this evening, not only because the subject we're going to be discussing, of course, as you well know, occupies the daily headlines, and justifiably so, because it's an extraordinarily important subject for all of us, but because the speaker tonight, Michael Krepon, I can think of no one who has been more deeply immersed or who has greater expertise on the subject of nuclear non-proliferation and other nuclear issues than our guest speaker. So we're very, very fortunate to have him. He's come all the way from deepest rural Virginia to be with us this evening. So we're very, very grateful. I'm going to not go through his entire extraordinary lengthy bio, but I do want to give you just a few highlights of this extraordinary background that Michael has. He started, I don't want to say how many years ago, but a long, long, long time ago in the early 1970s on Capitol Hill as an aide to one of the foremost congressmen at the time who was working on issues of non-proliferation. And of course, this is the height of the Cold War. And so Michael started as an aide on Capitol Hill. He then, during the Carter administration, was recruited by the State Department to join a small, very elite staff at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency to work on issues of non-proliferation, again, right during the height of the Cold War. And then there were a few steps along the way, and in 1989, Michael became the co-founder of what became known as the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., which quickly became one of the preeminent think tanks in Washington, and the preeminent think tank in Washington, D.C., focused predominantly on issues of nuclear non-proliferation and other nuclear issues. And Michael served as the CEO and president of the Stimson Center for the first 10 years or so of its existence. He continues to be involved with Stimson as a, I don't know what his title is today. He's an emeritus and he's a senior this and a senior that, but he continues on with the Stimson Center. But he was the founder of this great institution. And during this period, going forward, he also found time to serve as a professor, a diplomat scholar in residence at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He found time also to author or edit more than 20 published books and countless, I don't know how many op-eds and published articles at the time, all on the same, generally on the same subject, and became increasingly recognized because of this as one of the preeminent experts on the issues of nuclear non-proliferation. And finally, in 2015, and this I have to read because I could never remember how to say it, the Carnegie Foundation awarded Michael one of the most prestigious awards, the Therese Delpech Memorial Award, in recognition of a lifetime achievement in non-government work to reduce nuclear dangers. This was a great award that he received in 2015. Finally, let me just say that there are a couple of things that are not on his bio that I think are extraordinarily important and distinctive. First, he had the wisdom and foresight more than 35 years ago to marry an extraordinary young lady at the time, Sandra Sabine, who came with him this evening, and so we welcome you also, Sandra. It's not on his bio. And finally, Michael and I have been best friends since graduate school. We won't tell you how many decades ago that was, but I rank him amongst my very closest personal friends. And this gives me very, very special pleasure this evening to be the one asked to invite him to the podium tonight and to say we're so very, very pleased that you could come all this way to be with us. And as I said at the outset, we are in for a treat. So Michael, thank you for coming. We're looking forward to it. And so is everybody.
Roger is a very special person in my life. I have many images of him. We've known each other for a long time. The one that I want to convey to you is of a canoe trip. He knows where I'm going. The whitewater of West Virginia. I'm sure the whitewater is great here, but the whitewater of West Virginia is awesome too. And we're sitting around a campfire. It's morning. The mists are rising off the water. And Roger is reading the Wall Street Journal. I laugh whenever I think about that. Gloria, where are you, Gloria? Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for being flexible about the scheduling. It's an honor for me to be here with my wife of 42 years. I'm going to talk, I know you're interested about North Korea, and I'm going to talk about North Korea. But I want to range more broadly than that. I'm going to call this talk, or title this talk, The Rise and Demise of Nuclear Arms Control and How to Rebound from Tough Times. We live, obviously, in a time of troubles, a time of rising nuclear danger. It's a scary time. Two wild cards, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un may or may not have a summit meeting. This isn't a comforting thought, whether they meet or don't meet. Trump has walked away from the Iran nuclear deal without a better alternative. Should I be doing something about this echo? The stewards of Iran's nuclear program, the mullahs and the Revolutionary Guards, have newfound flexibility to disregard negotiated constraints at a time and at a pace of their choosing. The Kremlin's misbehaving badly, violating treaties, and the sovereignty of its neighbors. Beijing is flexing its muscles. I could add brushstrokes to this picture, but the picture is clear and very worrisome. But, dear Vermonters, the optimists, the pessimists, the hardened realists among you, I'm here to tell you that we've been through worse. We've been through worse. And we've managed to survive. We've managed to figure out ways to reduce nuclear dangers. We've managed to figure out the right track after going down the wrong track. And we can do it again. I want to tell you an extraordinary story. The first part of this story defies all odds. Amazing feats were accomplished by very purposeful people. The second part of my story is different. At the very peak of success in reducing nuclear dangers and nuclear weapons, there was a great reversal, a reversal of fortunes. Decades of hard work began to unravel. We're living this story, this part of the story, right now. The future of this story has yet to be written, and I'm going to leave that for last. as worried as you are today, think about how bad things were after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb utterly unnerved your parents. I'd like to say your grandparents, but it's mostly your parents. There was no defense against this weapon. No defense. It could appear suddenly at any time. The fear of surprise attack was uppermost in everyone's mind. And then along came a bomb that was way more powerful than the atomic bomb. A bomb that could have limitless destructive capacity, the hydrogen bomb. The United States and the Soviet Union were the most powerful, were history's most powerful geopolitical and ideological foes. There were no negotiations between them. No negotiations to reduce nuclear danger. Instead, a virulent nuclear arms race was underway. There was no such thing as arms control. There were no treaties. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a strong push for nuclear abolition. There's never been a stronger push for nuclear abolition than after World War II ended. Some of our best minds, our best scientists, leading public figures, set out plans for international control of atomic energy. Without the international control of atomic energy, abolition would be a pipe dream. Leading this charge were men of science, including some of the key bomb makers. Albert Einstein told stunned Americans and scared Americans that the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking. And we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. The title of a popular book, you might even find it in the Northshire bookstore. A reprint of this book called One War or None. One World or None. It was published in 1946 initially. But world government wasn't in the cards. It wasn't possible. The United States and the Soviet Union were not going to have a kumbaya moment. They were going to divide Europe and engage in a nuclear arms race and compete for advantage elsewhere. The pursuit of abolition after World War II was an abject failure. And yet, despite this failure, the weapons that ended World War II, some called them the winning weapon, war-winning weapons. Weapons were not used. These weapons were not used on battlefields. The United States and the Soviet Union managed to survive the Cold War without fighting and using mushroom clouds on battlefields. No one was foolish enough to predict this possibility in 1945. It was impossible, and yet it happened. No mushroom clouds on battlefields to this day. Offsetting nuclear arsenals, deterrence, saved the day, or so we hear. We hear that because deterrence saved the day, we need to spend far more than $1 trillion to keep this machine humming over the next 3 decades. Let's be clear about this. Deterrence alone is extremely dangerous. Deterrence is nuclear weapons locked and loaded permanently. In a big crisis, nuclear weapons are the problem. They're not the solution. And we've had a few close calls, especially in crises. Deterrence helped us avoid nuclear exchanges, just barely. But deterrence doesn't reduce nuclear danger. It doesn't. Deterrence increases nuclear danger. So in a world where abolition after 1945 was not an option, and where deterrence was downright dangerous, we needed something else. Something that could actually reduce nuclear dangers. That something was called nuclear arms control. It was conceived by brainiacs in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. The fundamental concept of arms control was to make the best of a bad bargain. The bad bargain would be called mutual assured destruction. You launch a weapon at me, I retaliate. And escalation control, not so easy. Never has an acronym so deserving of disdain managed to accomplish so much. But MAD wasn't just about deterrence. It was also about reassurance. Deterrence without reassurance doesn't get you from here to there. It doesn't get you to a world in which there are no mushroom clouds on battlefields. The reassurance piece is crucial. And that's what arms control proposed to do. The Cuban Missile Crisis kick-started nuclear arms control. Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to a ban on testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So maybe none of you but your parents remember mushroom clouds. Remember seeing them on the news, or maybe even seeing them in person. There was powerful opposition to a ban on atmospheric testing in this country, on Capitol Hill and at the nuclear weapons labs. Deterrence requires constant refinement. It requires new and better nuclear weapon designs. And in order to certify these new and better nuclear weapon designs, you needed to test them. But public health hazards of continued atmospheric testing could no longer be swept under the rug. There were stories about contamination of mother's milk, of bones and teeth as a result of these many atmospheric tests. Public insistence demanded an end to atmospheric testing. And this public insistence overrode the requirements of specialists. Next came an ambitious treaty to protect space from weapons of mass destruction. This was in 1967, 4 years later. The Outer Space Treaty declared that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and shall be the province of all mankind. And that's thinking big. The following year, another huge accomplishment, a treaty to prevent nuclear proliferation. Without it, there would be no sense of nuclear order in this world, and there would be many more states with nuclear weapons. The Outer Space Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty were the accomplishments of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. I ask those of you of a certain age to think more kindly of him. Then came Nixon and Kissinger, who negotiated, despite themselves, foundational agreements that strictly limited national missile defenses and set the first tentative and deeply imperfect limitations on strategic offensive arms. This was in 1972. The Offensive Arms Treaty was so porous, and the Pentagon and the Soviet General Staff would have it no other way, that when these loopholes were exploited, there was a growing backlash against this thing called nuclear arms control. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was the subject of an intense national debate. And the focus of this debate was on Capitol Hill because the Senate needed to consent to this, to ratification, and the House and the Senate needed to spend the money or refuse to spend the money because it was going to be prohibited by this treaty. Huge debate. It was so hard for our national leaders, our leaders on Capitol Hill back then, to accept the notion of national vulnerability. They don't accept it today. But with the Republican administration and very committed people, deeply versed in the issues, this debate ended with the acceptance of national vulnerability. Some people called it immoral, but vulnerability wasn't optional back then. We didn't have the technology to defend our country back in the early 1970s against these kinds of attacks. And we could make the best of a bad bargain of being vulnerable. And we could use this treaty as a stepping stone to cap the nuclear offensive arms competition and then to build it down. That was the theory, at least. And lo and behold, it happened. Along came Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, truly an odd couple. They were the first US and Soviet leaders who were not prisoners of nuclear weapons. They didn't just go along. They wanted to reduce these weapons. The more the merrier. And why not stop there? They also wanted abolition. Reagan and Gorbachev declared that a nuclear war could not be won and must not be fought. And they believed every single word. Now, none of this was obvious to people like me during the first Reagan administration. But when these two crockery breakers finally got together in Reagan's second term, They negotiated a treaty eliminating missiles with less than ocean-spanning ranges. Missiles that were either based in Europe or close enough to Europe where they could engage in nuclear exchanges. When they negotiated this treaty, which eliminated all of these missiles, they broke the back of the nuclear arms race. They agreed for the first time to accept on-site inspections at very sensitive military sites. They agreed in principle to 50% reductions in nuclear forces. The next 13 years, so now we're talking about 1987 to the year 2000, it was the golden age of nuclear arms control. Amazing successes. Unprecedented, unanticipated. The Soviet Union was dissolving, and George H.W. Bush acted swiftly to work with the Kremlin, not just for 50% reductions in these strategic offensive arms, but 85% reductions in 2 treaties. This was also a period of deep cuts in conventional forces, the forces that were positioned in Central Europe to fight World War III. But in order to implement all these extraordinary accomplishments, it was up to President Clinton to convince the newly independent states of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine that they should voluntarily give up their sudden nuclear inheritance. These countries became nuclear powers after the Soviet Union dissolved. And the Kremlin said, we're willing to do all these things, but you got to get our weapons back. And we helped. President Clinton accomplished that. He also negotiated, picking up the baton from the first President Bush, a chemical weapons convention that eliminated Cold War stockpiles. Clinton also provided the push needed at long last for a treaty completely ending nuclear weapons tests. And in perhaps the most extraordinary accomplishment of all, better than the treaties I've mentioned, better than the reductions I've mentioned, US and Soviet scientists, nuclear scientists, laboratory officials and workers joined forces in an extraordinary effort of cooperative threat reduction. When the Soviet Union dissolved, there was enough fissile material on the ground to make another 17,000 nuclear weapons. And the old system of guns and guards that worked during the Soviet Union's time wasn't going to work after the Soviet Union dissolved. So our nuclear weapons labs and Soviet/Russian nuclear weapons labs worked out ways to lock down these dangerous weapons and materials. And we haven't experienced a single incident of nuclear terrorism from these stocks. Not bad for government work. And here we are, or let me say at the beginning of a new century. Nuclear arms control was an extraordinary success story. And here we are in 2018, watching these achievements unravel. What happened? How did the rise of nuclear arms control turn so dramatically to its demise? Well, one thing that happened was that we won the Cold War. And that changed quite a bit. The Democratic Party kind of lost interest in nuclear arms control. We had a lot of things to implement for these existing treaties, and there were other issues worthy of their time and consideration. The Republican Party took aim at these constraints, these treaties. Why should the world's sole surviving superpower treat Russia as an equal or place constraints on its freedom of action? Those who wanted to be free of the bonds of mutual assured destruction felt free to do so. Three months after 9/11, President George W. Bush announced the U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. There was no domestic hue and cry, really. There were ways to accommodate this treaty with the emerging missile threats, but that would have entailed endless negotiating with Moscow, and the Bush administration wouldn't have it. Without tough constraints on missile defenses, deeper cuts on missile offenses became much more unlikely. The second thing that happened was that the division of Europe, excuse me, the Cold War division of Europe shifted eastward, way eastward. During the Cold War, one of the conditions necessary to achieve nuclear and conventional arms reductions was the acceptance of a divided Europe. But no more. After the Cold War ended, after the Soviet Union dissolved, the Clinton administration, to begin with, had a decision to make. Do we stick with NATO as is? Do we expand NATO eastward? Or try some other mechanism to help reassure the newly freed countries of the Warsaw Pact and of the Soviet Union? And the decision was made to expand NATO. First, just a little. But then, in the George W. Bush administration, it was to expand it a lot, including the 3 Baltic states. And the Bush administration also wanted to include Ukraine and Georgia into an expanded NATO. The Kremlin made sure that wasn't going to happen by annexing part of Ukraine and violating its sovereignty in eastern Ukraine with Russian forces and consultants, hardly independent consultants. Same for Georgia. Vladimir Putin, he's the third thing that happened. He's the third explanation for this turnaround. He hated treaties that reflected Russia's weakness after the Cold War ended. He systematically began to disregard these obligations. He's violated conventional, nuclear, and chemical arms control agreements. And we can't look the other way at that. We can't look the other way at the annexation of Ukraine, of Crimea. Or what's happening in Georgia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. You know, after World War II, maps of the world didn't change, at least by means of external actions, invasion. Maps changed because countries came apart, and there were domestic reasons for that. But when Russian troops annexed Ukraine by force of arms, that changed a lot. It's extremely hard to engage in ambitious diplomacy when there's map changing going on by aggressive means. The days of modest, let alone ambitious, diplomacy to reduce nuclear dangers went into hibernation. The fourth thing that happened was that the Republican Party lost its moorings. The kind of work and the accomplishments during this era of arms control, it's only possible with bipartisan support. You need 67 votes in the Senate to consent to a treaty's ratification. But the Republican Party's international wing retired or faced embarrassing primary losses. The party's actuarial tables turned. The new Republican Party was about coercive threat reduction, not cooperative threat reduction. It was about the exercise of power and not the negotiation of new treaties. The fifth thing that happened after America's unipolar moment was that America's power dissolved far faster than anyone could anticipate in the year 2000, right before 9/11. The period from 9/11 to the present moment has been a period of steep decline in U.S. international standing and influence. Now Russia has regained its footing. Beijing began to eat Washington's breakfast, lunch, and dinner by focusing on economics rather than on nuclear weapons. The global nuclear order began to unravel. Treaties expired without replacement, languished in the Senate's calendar, or were violated. We have 2 new states in South Asia that have tested nuclear weapons. They're engaged in an arms race. Iran also embarked on ambitious nuclear plans. The sixth thing that happened was Donald Trump. Magical thinking that has infected other parts of U.S. culture, media, and politics also has found a home in the inner sanctum of the White House. Get a better deal with Iran by walking away from one that everybody else wants to keep? That's magical thinking. Create a ghost ship at Foggy Bottom with few hands on deck at the State Department? That's magical thinking. Refuse to accept a mutual deterrence relationship with North Korea. even if this means a preventive war and the possibility of mushroom clouds. That's magical thinking. Or maybe negotiate a deal with North Korea. I don't know. What day is this? But Trump and young Mr. Kim are not Reagan and Gorbachev. They're not staffed by people like those who staffed Reagan and Gorbachev. They are two jokers in the deck. If they're the two jokers in the deck. And if denuclearization doesn't happen, what then? We've sped a long way downhill. As a result of the bad news that I've just recounted, many people have again turned to the solution of abolition. They've championed a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, leaving the challenges of implementation to the states that are armed with nuclear weapons. This ban treaty serves, I think, several useful purposes, and I don't think it causes harm. But it seems like another example of magical thinking. So where do we go from here? This is the important part. How do we revive efforts to reduce nuclear dangers and nuclear weapons by non-military means? The answer, of course, depends in part on whether we have reached rock bottom or we are still in a downward slide. And we can't know the answer to that. But we can act to prevent a further downward slide. In my view, the most important way to apply commitment and energy to reduce nuclear weapons right now is to do everything in our power to prevent a war between the United States and North Korea. Nothing good can come from this war. A second war on the Korean Peninsula. The first war on the Korean Peninsula wasn't so good. And the second one can be way worse. It could result in this mushroom cloud phenomenon on a battlefield. And I don't think there would be just one if a war begins. And if there are mushroom clouds on battlefields, even if they are localized to the Korean Peninsula, I think we can assume there would be a resumption of nuclear testing by many countries who've been waiting to do this and would like to do this. What would the world look like with the resumption, with the next mushroom cloud on a battlefield? It would look like the world looked like after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with a couple of important exceptions. One, there would be 9 countries, not just one, with nuclear weapons. And there would be 15,000 of these weapons around, still. So, job one is to speak up against a war on the Korean Peninsula and support diplomacy, even the diplomacy between the two jokers in the deck. Now here's the good news. And please take this to heart. Positive developments can and have gained momentum from bad news. When the dangers scare us sufficiently to become strongly engaged. And when we, the people, are strongly engaged, good things can happen. The quest to reduce nuclear dangers and nuclear weapons is strangely paradoxical. How many of you thought that when Reagan was elected, good things would happen? Or that LBJ could do good things in the international arena? Sometimes good developments can lead to bad outcomes, as well as the reverse. We wouldn't have a President Obama, in my judgment, without a President George W. Bush. And I don't think we would have had a President Donald Trump without a President Obama. This is the time to make paradox our enabler. I think paradox is totally apparent at present in the US-North Korean engagement, such as it is. Trump has accomplished quite a bit, unknowingly. No, the North and the South are talking to each other. That's hugely important. And as long as they talk and improve relations, regardless of what Trump does and says, I do not believe there will be a war on the Korean Peninsula. A war with Iran would also be catastrophic. But this war, like a war on the Korean Peninsula, is unwanted by the Pentagon and by the American public. An Iranian nuclear weapons stockpile isn't yet a given, because if Iran makes bombs, it is greatly increasing the likelihood that Saudi Arabia and Turkey will also make bombs. And Iran isn't going to be better off in its region if two more of its neighbors have nuclear weapons. So this isn't a lost cause either. Beijing and New Delhi have not yet caught the Western virus of thinking about nuclear weapons as war-fighting instruments. They have adopted an Eastern approach. They're political instruments. They're not military instruments. We don't have to go overboard like other countries have. The first principle of a rising power is a growing economy. That's job number one. And New Delhi and Beijing, I think, believe this. It could change. But we have that to work with. Not so, oh, by the way, New Delhi and Beijing have agreed, have stated their intention not to use nuclear weapons first. They won't be the first ones to use nuclear weapons first on a battlefield. Israel has said the same thing. Not so for the United States, Russia, and Pakistan. These states reserve the right to use nuclear weapons first. And they're all modernizing their missiles and their submarines and their bombers. So what can we do to reduce nuclear dangers when there are no negotiations, at least not now, between Washington and Moscow, because these two countries have most of the nuclear weapons, most of them. Now, we're accustomed to, especially we in the think tank community, are accustomed to writing long, detailed to-do lists. Hundreds of shoulds and musts and need tos. And incoming administrations have difficulty doing just a few things, let alone hundreds of to-dos on the nuclear side. And treaties no longer have sufficient backing on Capitol Hill. So we have to think creatively, and creativity brings us back to basics. The essence, the pillars of nuclear risk reduction are two things. And they happen to be the two things that we're best at in terms of expressing insistence, and that political leaders are required to pay heed. These two things are no use of nuclear weapons on battlefields, no more mushroom clouds. I would propose that we set the goal of no more mushroom clouds up to 2045. 2045, that seems like a long way off. Well, 2045 is the 100th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we have 30 more years to go. That sounds like it's tough, but we've already made it through 7 decades without the use of a nuclear weapon on a battlefield. And we can surely extend that day by day, crisis by crisis, just the way the people did it during the last 7 decades. The second thing that we can do, we can accomplish, is to insist on no more nuclear testing. No more. There have already been over 2,000 of these tests, most by the United States and the Soviet Union. But we have a treaty, hasn't entered into force, banning these tests. And even though the treaty hasn't entered into force, it has been respected by every country except North Korea. And who knows, maybe as an outcome, maybe as an outcome of the current engagement with North Korea, they'll also refrain from testing again. The United States hasn't tested since 1992. That wasn't easy, by the way. People want to test. Russia, Soviet Union, hasn't tested either for a quarter century. A quarter century. None of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council have tested a nuclear weapon since 1996. India and Pakistan tested quickly this month, I think maybe even today, in 1998. Pakistan conducted its last tests, either today or yesterday. They haven't tested since. So North Korea is the outlier. Who wants to be like North Korea? Why is it so effective? Why are these two measures so effective over time? If nuclear weapons aren't used on a battlefield for 70 years, it's extremely hard for any national leader to cross that threshold. And if nuclear weapons aren't used on a battlefield for 100 years, imagine how hard it will be. Every test of a nuclear device is an expression of national power. See how powerful we are. We mean to use these weapons if we have to. That's why we're testing them. If you don't test them for the next 30 years, which I believe to be doable, day by day, crisis by crisis, public insistence, thou shalt not test a nuclear weapon. How good are these weapons going to be 100 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki? If they dare not be used on a battlefield, or if leaders dare not even test them. And by the way, the George W. Bush administration and the Trump administration have not proposed the resumption of testing. They know what the public reaction would be, your public reaction. So, yeah, things are bad. But we've accomplished a lot. And I think you've accomplished more than you even think. You and your fellow citizens. The achievements of the era of nuclear arms control were not accidental. They happened by dint of hard work and public support. New achievements are possible, but they require different strategies to achieve success. Abolition is an end state. It's not a strategy. Fine-tuning nuclear warfighting capabilities is a dead-end strategy. Strengthening the norms against battlefield use and nuclear testing is a strategy that can succeed. And it's in our hands. We can help reduce nuclear dangers, even now, by keeping our eye on these two essentials and by raising our voices. My voice has been raised long enough, and I welcome your thoughts or reactions, rebuttals, questions.
Michael, what do you think changed Kim's mind to engage?
I think status is an important factor. I'm not inside his head. But he and his father and grandfather have always wanted to be on a big stage with an American president, a serving American president. So I think that's part of it. He has said, if his words mean anything, if we are to take him literally, he says that we now have enough to deter. Job number one is to grow our country's economy. We need direct foreign investment. We want to look like South Korea, actually. I think that has something to do with it. Whether he gets what he wants from these negotiations, some of what he wants, depends whether Trump is willing to accept something less than his maximalist position. And this, of course, we just don't know. But I think the engagement piece is crucial. And it has already broken the ice in some very positive ways. Ways that make a war less likely. So I'm in favor of this engagement, even though Lord knows.
Most of what you talked about was diplomacy and the ability to work with governments to have them move in the right direction on these issues. And I can't help but worry about non-governments, primarily terrorists, I guess, and what ISIS or other groups might, what havoc they might wreak.
That's a worthwhile worry. But isn't it remarkable that there hasn't been an act of nuclear terrorism, an improvised nuclear device, or a mushroom cloud forming device that has been exploded to date since we've started seriously worrying about this problem over a quarter century ago? What accounts for that? You know, one size doesn't fit all. And people who have thought hard about this problem have come up with some tentative answers. You can do so much damage with a semi-automatic weapon. Or with an IED. I could explain the reference to IUD, but I don't want to. But she knows what I'm talking about. If this was such a priority for the bad guys, it would have happened. Which is not to say it won't happen tomorrow. But they seem to be going in easier directions.
I'm probably all wrong, but it seems to me that before the George Bush was talking about the axis of evil, and you know who they are, that Kim wasn't as bad, but I think being called, denounced in this way, I think was upsetting to him, or that made him very angry or anxious or all of these things. So that right now, when it would be discussed that North and South Korea should talk on their own, the objection seemed to be that China would object to a unified Korean peninsula. I think we've come to the point where Moon seems to be a sane person talking, and he and Kim can get together and talk. And I think China could be on the side, but I think they would accept it. And I think the Korean War is a long time ago, and we were part of that war, but that really isn't our war at all. And it's about time that North Korea and South Korea sit down and unify, and I think that would calm Kim way down. And we should stay out of this. We're just a lot of clatter with this. This is not our issue. It's North and South Korea, really, and we should get away from it. Now, your response.
If we were to withdraw from problem solving, even misguided problem solving, if we were to say, you guys figure it out, And on top of that, if we were to withdraw our forces on the ground, which I kind of think you would accept.
Yes.
Then you have, then you're going to add, then the question will arise. What will South Korea think of this? What will Japan think of this? What will U.S. allies and friends in other parts of the world think of this withdrawal of responsibility for dealing with the problem? And we're already on a slippery slope of losing influence and leadership for friends and allies all over. I think this would probably accelerate it. I do. Now, I would urge you, I think this is a great time to think out of the box. And I think one possibility, what North Korea needs besides economics is reassurance.
That's what I'm talking about.
They need reassurance. And there are other ways to do that without the U.S. skipping down. One way to do it is to base some Chinese military forces in the north and U.S. forces remaining in the south as guarantors of no war and a dialogue, at least among the four parties, and probably more. So China is a big part of the reduction of nuclear dangers on the Korean Peninsula.
What was the calculus, as you see it, for the U.S. to push or suggest the placement of nuclear materials in Ukraine, I'm sorry, the expansion of NATO and capabilities in Ukraine and Georgia, given especially the case of Ukraine with multiple centuries of Russian ethnic, strategic, and truly heartfelt engagement in Ukraine. And so under the concept of rational actors, what was the rationality of suggesting NATO membership in those cases? They must have known that it would invite a much more visceral
Pushback.
nationalist pushback compared to Latvia, for example.
Well, Latvia stuck in the Kremlin's craw, too. I think the rationale was we're number one. We are the sole superpower in the world. We can do what we like. And the Kremlin has to accept it. Certainly it wasn't because these countries had something to offer an alliance in terms of military assets, perhaps basing. But Henry Kissinger wrote a long time ago, in 1957, in one of his big books, that you don't add allies if they don't have something to contribute. And most of the allies that we added after the Cold War ended have minuscule defense budgets, tiny forces on the ground. They're kind of indefensible, actually, some of them. We won. They lost. I think this was a tragic error to expand NATO. And there was an idea circulating at the time, a counter idea. Some of you may remember hearing about it, called the Partnership for Peace with these countries. Give them a separate status, non-allies, but close working partnerships, including military to military. But NATO expansion was the call. And once you started to expand NATO, where do you stop? The answer for some was right at the Russian border.
Where do you see the coherent orientation towards effective strategic thinking that is influencing, if it is at this point, our development of an approach to North Korea? We can see the giant man out there who is aggrandizing attention and so forth. But where is the backup of the strategic thinking that comes out of the expertise that does exist within our institutions, both in terms of state, in terms actually of the Defense Department and elsewhere, that see things from a rational and coherent, comprehensive, long-term perspective?
There are good people working the Korean negotiation problem. They exist in the State Department, but there are more of them and more influential people working the problem at the Pentagon and in the intelligence community. So the questions we have, and I suspect you have, is you can have great staff work. Do these options make their way up to the president? And does the president, what does the president do with them? So, but there are committed people who are not in the public eye who are working this problem. And I trust that they will have sound analysis and sound advice. The man who carries the heaviest load here is the Secretary of Defense. So, not a completely reassuring answer. But good people are working the problem. I do a lot of work with India and Pakistan. And one of my areas of special interest in writing is crisis management on the subcontinent. And if this topic really interests you, or any of the stuff I've talked about, you can go to the Stimson Center website, www.stimson, as in Henry L., .org. The www.stimson.org. The U.S. is the primary crisis manager in South Asia, partly because Beijing doesn't want the job. But Beijing is an important complementary player. There's a lot of coordination during crises with Beijing. And Beijing does talk effectively to Pakistan, not so much with India. That's more our job. But even in the lack of balance that the U.S. now has towards India and Pakistan, we're still the primary crisis manager. Because if leaders in both countries want to avoid battlefield use, we could be of service. And nobody can be of more service. But we need reinforcing messages, not just from Beijing, from the UN Secretary General, from the Prime Minister of Great Britain, from the EU leadership. The whole world coordinates easily during a severe crisis between India and Pakistan, which is a good thing.
I really enjoyed your talk and appreciate your search for solutions to the downward spiral you described so well. And I try always to be optimistic about these things too, but I have to confess that the appointments of Mike Pompeo and John Bolton terrify me. And I wonder whether I'm sure you know them both, and I know you followed Bolton's career carefully.
Not personally.
No, but institutionally. Say a few words, if you would, about where we're going with those appointments.
Bolton is so tightly wound. He's so intense. My hunch is that he and Trump are not going to get along too well. I mean, it may take time. It's not a natural partnership. So it's true he's capable of making bad decisions and promoting bad decisions. He has a track record. But when you ask the President of the United States to take actions that in effect start a war against a nuclear armed state, the President is going to have to think very long and hard about that. When you ask the Pentagon to send men and women in harm's way on the Korean Peninsula or Iran, when we have soldiers paying the price still in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and special forces in more countries than are publicly available or known, the Pentagon doesn't want this. And in many ways, the Pentagon is doing the State Department's job. I think that's a good thing. I don't know this man, Pompeo. He's such a new figure in this set of issues. But he strikes me as someone who has a wonderful instinct for knowing what he doesn't know. That's so important. And therefore, I think he's capable of better advice than Bolton would give the president. There's a term of art in the nuclear business. It's called damage limitation. It has a terrible meaning in the nuclear business. It means that you target other weapons that could damage you. Limit the damage to yourself. It's part of a war-winning strategy. I think we too are obliged to think about these issues that I've talked about, that you think about, in damage limitation terms. We don't have to win every argument. We don't have to win about this weapon system or that weapon system. We can lose budgetary debates. We can lose many, many debates. But if we win two things, no battlefield use, no testing, in the long run, we will win everything. So take that message home with you. Thank you so much. Great to be here. Big fella.